Chapter 4, The Market Forces of Supply and Demand. This is perhaps the most important chapter in the textbook. It's worth mentioning that investing extra time to master this chapter will make it easier for you to learn much of the subsequent material in this book. This is one of the longest chapters in the textbook, and the PowerPoint file, this video lecture, is one of the most graph intensive. Many of my students taking economics for the first time have difficulty grasping the graphs. However, they are critically important to this chapter and all the subsequent chapters in the book in economics overall. So, on your behalf, an extra degree of study is certainly appropriate and encouraged. Now we take a look at markets and competition. A market is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular product. A competitive market is one where there are many buyers and many sellers, and each has a negligible or minimal effect on price. In a perfectly competitive market, all goods are exactly the same, and buyers and sellers are so numerous that no one can affect the market price. Each is what we call a price taker. In this chapter, we're going to assume that markets are perfectly competitive. In the real world, there are relatively few perfectly competitive markets. Again, let me emphasize perfectly competitive markets. Most goods come in lots of different varieties, including something like ice cream, the example given in the textbook. And there are many markets in which the number of firms is small enough that some of them have the ability to affect the market price. So again, in the real world, there are relatively few, emphasis on perfectly competitive markets. There are competitive markets, but very few perfectly competitive markets. So when we assume this in this chapter, it is very much for instructive reasons. For now, though, we'll look at supply and demand in perfectly competitive markets for two reasons. First, it's easier to learn. Understanding perfectly competitive markets makes it a lot easier to learn the more realistic but complicated analysis of imperfectly competitive markets. Secondly, despite the lack of realism, the perfectly competitive model can teach us a lot about how the world works. And we'll see this many times in this chapter and other chapters that follow. So let's talk about demand. Demand comes from the behavior of buyers. Now, within demand, there's different variations here. The quantity demanded of any good is the amount of the good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Now, the law of demand is the claim that the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of a good rises. Other things being equal, otherwise known as ceteris paribus, other things being equal, holding all other things constant. Demand's a little easier for beginning economists to comprehend because we're all consumers, we're all demanders. If something becomes more expensive, we're much more likely to want less of it. If it becomes less expensive and it's something that we demand anyway, we're going to want more of it. To illustrate this, we use the demand schedule. The demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. Here's an example. Helen's demand for lattes. Notice that Helen's preferences obey the law of demand. At a low price, like free, she demands more. At a high price, like 6, she demands less. As you can see, as price increases, the quantity of lattes demanded decreases. It's an inverse relationship. And with inverse relationships, we typically graphically see a negative, a downward curve. So we're going to put Helen's demand schedule onto a graph. On the left vertical axis, we have the price of lattes from $0 to $6. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of lattes demanded, 0 to 15 and onwards. We can plot the prices. We have the prices here and their corresponding quantities. At $6, Helen wants 4 lattes. At $3, Helen wants 10 lattes, and so on and so forth. You just make your dots there, and then we play everybody's favorite game, connect the dots, and you have a demand curve. So now we look at market demand versus individual demand. Helen's just one person. There are more than just Helen in the market. There's Helen, there's Ken, there's Chris, there's Bob, there's all these people. The quantity demanded in the market is the sum of the quantities demanded by all buyers at each price. So you take all these different people and you add up their quantity demanded at the different prices, and you have your overall market demand. Now obviously Helen and Ken are going to differ in the quantities that they want at different prices. Suppose Helen and Ken are the only 2 buyers in the latte market though. QD here is quantity demanded. And we have our prices, 0, 1, so on and so forth, all the way up to 6. We know Helen's quantity demanded for the different prices, but now we find out Ken's quantity demanded. He likes lattes too, but about half as much as Helen does in terms of quantity here. So we take Helen and Ken, again, they're the only 2 buyers in this fictitious example, and we add their quantity demanded up. So at $0, the market quantity demanded, again, the market's made up of Ken and Helen, is 24. At $6, it's 6. Now, this example violates the quote-unquote many buyers condition of perfect competition, yet we're merely here just trying to show that at each price, the quantity demanded in the market is the sum of the quantity demanded by each buyer in the market. This holds whether there's 2 buyers or 2 million buyers. Obviously, it'd be a lot harder to illustrate 2 million buyers, which is much more realistic. But it would be harder to fit that data on the slide, so we'll settle for 2 for now. So now we look at the sum of the buyers in the market, the consumer sum, the quantity demanded for the market, and we plot it just like we did before. $6. At $6, there's people want 6. At $1, they want 21, and so on and so forth. Make your dots, connect the points. Now, there can be things that shift demand. Demand curve shifters. The demand curve shows, again, the demand curve shows how prices affect quantity demanded, all other things being equal. These other things are non-price determinants of demand. For example, things that determine buyers' demand for a good and other than the good's price. So it's not generally not price. If you don't like a coffee's flavor, that can affect your demand, that can shift your demand. If there's a positive health report that says caffeine in a latte helps you live longer, that can affect your demand, things like that. So changes in those shift the demand curve. Now notice I said shift the demand curve. A demand curve shifter can be the number of buyers. An increase in the number of buyers increases quantity demanded at each price and shifts the demand curve to the right. Income is the first demand shifter discussed in the chapter in this textbook. We start with a different one, number of buyers, for the following reason. So when you're in the reading, they talk about income first. In the slides here, we're talking about the number of buyers first. In discussing the impact changes in income on the demand curve, the textbook also introduces the concept of normal goods and inferior goods. You may find it easier to learn about the curve shifts if the presentation focuses solely on the shift, at least initially, without simultaneously introducing the inferior goods and the normal goods. Again, here, another reason why I urge you to not only attend the lectures and watch the videos, but also to do the reading, because there's a bit of strategy here to expose you to different reasons why the demand curves shift. So back to the number of buyers. Suppose the number of buyers increases, then at each price, quantity demanded will increase, let's say by 5 in this example. Let's say it goes uniformly by 5. That's not typical, but beginning economics students, sometimes you often have trouble understanding the differences between movement along the curve and a shift of the curve. Here we're talking about a shift of the curve from an increased quantity of lattes purchased at each price. So this is not movement up and down the curve. This is movement of the curve. The entire curve shifts rightward. So another demand curve shifter, now we'll talk about income. Demand for a normal good is positively related to income. An increase in income causes an increase in the quantity demanded at each price. It shifts the demand curve to the right. There's an increase. Essentially, a normal good is a good that you want more of as you get higher pay. Demand for an inferior good is negatively related to income. An increase in income shifts the demand curves for inferior goods to the left. So as you earn more money, this is a good that you want less of. Classic examples: top ramen noodles. I'm pretty much sure that most college students on a budget are familiar with what a ramen noodle package is. Very inexpensive meal that you can throw together. And generally speaking, as people get more resources, they get more income, they eat less top ramen noodle. Normal goods, most goods are normal goods. Think electronics, think steak dinners, that type of thing. As you get more income, you generally consume more normal goods. Another demand curve shifter is the prices of related goods. Two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one causes an increase in the demand for another, or for the other. A good example is pizza and hamburgers. An increase in the price of pizza increases the demand for hamburgers, shifting the hamburger demand curve to the right. If you go down to a restaurant and they have pizza and hamburgers, you generally don't consume both at the same time. You pick pizza or hamburgers. If pizza is really expensive, you're more likely going to consume more hamburgers. So the increase in the price of pizza affects the demand for hamburgers. Other examples are Coke and Pepsi. They're seen as substitutes. If the price of one went really high, you would just consume more of the others. Laptops and desktop computers, CDs and music downloads are another example. Although an aging example, I would add. If two goods are complements, an increase in the price of one causes a fall in the demand for others. And a good example are computers and software. The price of computers rise. People buy fewer computers, therefore they buy less software. You wouldn't buy software if you didn't have a computer. The software demand curve shifts to the left. Other examples are college tuition and textbooks. If college tuition price goes through the roof, less students will go to college and less people would buy textbooks. Bagels and cream cheese are complements, eggs and bacon, so on and so forth. If the price of one goes down, it'll affect the demand for the other. If the price of one goes up, it'll affect the demand for the other as well. Now, one of the more interesting demand curve shifters is taste. In the field of marketing, there's a whole field called consumer behavior, and it focuses a lot on consumer taste. Anything that causes a shift in taste towards a good will increase demand for that good and shift its demand curve to the right. And it also could be a shift in taste that affects it negatively and shifts it to the left. The Atkins diet became popular in the 1990s. It caused an increase in the demand for eggs. because it really touted the benefits of an egg, the protein, all the good fats. And it shifted the demand curve to the right. So eggs got popular. So the demand for eggs shifted to the right. Along the lines of consumer behavior as well, another demand curve shifter is expectations. Expectations affect consumers' buying decisions. Examples include if people expect their incomes to rise, their demand for meals at expensive restaurants may increase. If the economy soars and people, if the economy sours, not soars. If it sours and people worry about their future job security, the demand for new cars, new automobiles may fall. So if you expect to have more money tomorrow, you might spend some money today. If you expect to have less money tomorrow, you might save some money today. So in summary, variables that influence buyers, you have price, number of buyers, income, price of related good, taste, and expectations. Price can cause movement along the demand curve. Your demand curve doesn't shift. You just move up and down the demand curve. So a change in price causes a movement along the demand curve. Very important distinction there. Number of buyers, income, price of related good, taste, and expectations, all those other things we were talking about in the earlier slides, all shift the demand curve. You should notice that the only determinant of quantity demanded that causes movement along the curve is price. Also notice price is one of the variables measured along the axes of the graph. So here's a handy rule of thumb you can use to remember whether the curve shifts. If the variable causing the demand to change is measured on one of the axes, you move along the curve. Okay. If the variable that causes the demand to change does not appear on either of the axes, then the curve shifts. So remember, we had price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. If it's something other than price or quantity, it's a shift in demand and not a movement along the demand curve. This rule of thumb works with all curves in economics that involve an XY relationship, including the supply curve, the marginal cost curve, the IS and LM curves, which is not covered in this book or this course, but just for future reference as you move on, and many others. Though it does not apply to curves drawn in time series graphs, which is something we cover a little bit later. So just keep that in mind. So we can draw a demand curve for, say, music downloads, as examples given in the book, and what happens in each of the following scenarios and why. The price of iPads falls, or iPods, falls. So if the price changes, that's something that's on the axis, you're moving along the curve. Again, the price of music downloads falls, and the price of CDs falls. So again, we actually need to look at this in terms of not only looking at the demand curve for music downloads, but we need to consider what iPods, the download itself, and CDs are. So iPods and music downloads are complements. So if the price of iPods fall, there's real potential for the demand for music downloads to increase. More people will buy iPods. If the price of music downloads itself falls, obviously if something's less expensive, consumers may want more of it. So there can be an increase in demand, or a movement along the demand curve, I should say. So the first one, if the price of iPods falls, we're talking about a complement here. There's a potential shift in the demand curve. The price of music downloads falls, we're talking about potential movement along the demand curve. And then lastly, the price of CDs fall. CDs are substitutes for music downloads. So if CDs become less expensive than, say, music downloads, which is hard to imagine in this day and age, the consumption, the demand for music downloads may decrease. Now, these are all in theory based on what we just went through in the previous slides. Let's see if we can illustrate it here. The first example, example A, the price of iPods fall. So on the left-hand side, you have here the price of music downloads and then the quantity of music downloads, because again, we're concerned with what's going to happen with music downloads. Music downloads and iPods are complements. A fall in the price of iPods shifts the demand curve for music downloads to the right. I should point out that there are no numbers or units on either axis on the graph here. We're using P1 and Q1 to represent the initial price and quantity rather than specific numerical values. This is common because much of economic analysis, the goal is to see is only to see what direction the changes occur in and not the specific amounts. Besides, if we put numbers on this graph, they would have just been made up anyway, so why bother? Also, the price of music downloads is the same, but the quantity demanded is now higher. So again, in this example, the price of iPods fell. The price of music downloads didn't change, but its complement, the iPod, the player, fell. In fact, this is the nature of a shift of a curve. At any given price, the quantity is different than before. Now, looking at our second example here, the price of music downloads fall. So again, this is directly related to what our good of interest is here, the music downloads. So again, we have the price of music downloads on the vertical axis, the quantity of music downloads on the horizontal axis. The demand curve does not shift in this example. Remember, this is something that's on an axis, so it's a movement along the curve to a point with the lower price. Okay, and at the lower price, we have a higher quantity. This is our original point, our P1, Q1. Okay. Price dropped. We have a new P here. We have to find that on the demand curve. And we have a new quantity, Q2. So what happens here? P1 drops to P2. And correspondingly, when something becomes less expensive, Q1 moves to Q2. There's an increase in quantity. But again, movement along the demand curve versus a shift of the demand curve. Third example, price of CDs fall. Again, we're looking at CD prices changing. The price of music downloads is not changing. But CDs and music downloads are substitutes. A fall in the price of CDs shifts the demand for music downloads to the left. So again, we have the quantity of music downloads here on the horizontal, price of music downloads here. Because a complement became less expensive, there's a shift in the demand curve. Price of music downloads didn't change, but the quantity of music downloads did change due to the negative left shift of the demand curve for music downloads. So now let's shift gears to supply. The quantity supplied of any good is the amount that sellers are willing and able to sell. The law of supply is the claim that the quantity supplied of goods rises when the price of that good rises, all other things being equal, ceteris paribus, so assuming all other things equal. So supply comes from the behavior of sellers. Now, for beginning economics students that haven't either worked in retail or owned their own businesses, the supply side can be a little more challenging. Here, we have to drop our mode of thinking as demanders, as consumers, that we're much more used to doing, and put ourselves into the shoes of someone selling something. So you're a supplier. So what do you want more of? Well, you want a higher price to sell your goods, and at a higher price, you're willing to sell more of your goods. Why? Because that's more revenue, and more revenue means more profit. So let's take a look at the supply schedule. The supply schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. Examples. Before we talked about Helen and her lattes, now we're talking about Starbucks and their supply of lattes. Notice that Starbucks supply schedule obeys the law of supply. At $0, they're willing to supply 0 lattes. At $6, they're willing to supply 18 lattes. Again, this is just a fictitious example. using simple numbers. So as you can see, as the price of lattes increases, the willingness to supply lattes by Starbucks increases. So there's a positive relationship. And graphically, in a positive relationship, you're going to see an upward directing curve. Okay, so again, we have price on the left-hand side, quantity on the price on the vertical left hand, and quantity on the right side here on the horizontal axis. As price goes up, quantity goes up. At 0, Starbucks is selling 0 lattes. They make no money. At $6, hey, they're saying, hey, let's supply 18. So you just plot these out and connect the dots. We've been doing that since kindergarten. All right, so now looking at market supply versus individual supply, just like we did with demand, the quantity supplied in the market is the sum of the quantity supplied by all the sellers at each price, just like it was from all the buyers at each price for demand. Suppose Starbucks and Peet's are the only 2 sellers in this market. Again, an oversimplification is a clear violation of perfect competition, saying there's only 2 sellers. However, it's much easier for you to learn how the market supply curve relates to individual sellers in the 2-seller case instead of trying to illustrate it, say, with 100 sellers. At $0, Starbucks and Peet's, nobody's willing to offer lattes. At $1, you have Starbucks willing to do 3 and Peet's willing to do 2. That's a market quantity supplied. Again, QS is quantity supplied of 5, so on and so forth, all the way down to $6, where it's 18 and 12 is 30 total lattes on the market. So we can plot this. Again, positive relationship, 0. There's 0. At $1, there's 5. At $6, there's 30, so on and so forth. So we just connect the dots, and you have a supply curve. Now, the supply curve can shift as well. The supply curve shows how price affects quantity supplied, all other things being equal. Again, Latin word for that is ceteris paribus, or you can see it abbreviated CP. Sometimes in other economics courses if you go on to take more. These quote-unquote other things are non-price determinants of supply. Changes in them, those other things, shift the supply curve. Non-price determinants of supply simply mean the things other than the price of a good that determines the seller's supply of a good. So just like demand, price changes can move along the curve if we're talking about the product that we're interested in, like lattes. And then other things, non-price determinants, result in shifts of the curve. So shifts versus moving along. So supply curve shifters, first one we're going to look at is input prices. Now, keyword here is not just price, but input prices. Examples of input prices are wages and prices of raw materials. So again, your supplier, your manufacturer, your builder, you're something here that requires labor. So you have to pay that labor wages, and those wages are input costs. Okay, and prices of raw materials. If you're going to make a latte, you need milk, you need coffee, you need all these other things. Those are raw materials. A fall in input prices makes production more profitable at each output price. So firms supply a larger quantity at each price, and the supply curve shifts to the right. So if they're making more money supplying something that the input prices just became a little more affordable, they're willing to supply more of it. Now, in the second bullet point, the quote-unquote in English, output price just means that the price of the good that firms are producing and selling. I've used output price here to distinguish from input prices. So just so there's clear there. So this is the price that Starbucks charges, output price, and this is the price it pays to put together the lattes. So again, in this example, let's say with the latte example, suppose the price of milk falls. At each price, the quantity of latte supplied will increase by, let's say, uniformly 5 in this example. So milk's less expensive. They're making more money per latte. At $1, the market or Starbucks would supply 5. Now they're willing to supply 10, and so on and so forth. And you just have a shift in supply. positive shift in supply. The opposite could be true as well. If input prices go up, if milk became more expensive, they're making less money, this curve could shift to the left and they'd be less willing to supply, say, lattes at $1. There'd be a lower quantity. Another supply curve shifter is technology. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce a unit of output. Technology can make things more efficient. You can make more goods with less inputs, which cuts down on your costs, or the opposite could be true. A cost-saving technological improvement has the same effect as a fall in input prices. So if you're saving money through technology, your cost per unit of output that you're going to produce, say we have some new machine that makes the lattes with less milk, that causes Starbucks to have to use less milk, which lowers their costs and can shift the supply curve to the right, because again, the inputs then lower, and they're willing to supply more at a lower price. Another potential supply curve shifter is the number of sellers. Again, an increase in the number of sellers increases the quantity supplied of each price. So the S curve, the supply curve shifts to the right. This is commonly seen in competition. If more restaurants occupy a corner, there's more competition. There's more hamburgers and pizza or whatever being sold. So sellers see a need to try to compete with their other folks, and that can lower prices, that can provide more supply. But basically what you need to know from this slide is this: if there's more supply, something's more available, like through the increase of a number of sellers, the quantity supplied at each price increases, and that affects competition. Another supply curve shifter is expectations. A good example is events in the Middle East lead to expectations of higher oil prices. In response, owners of Texas oil fields reduce supply now and save some inventory to sell later at a higher price. So the supply curve decreases, it shifts to the left. All these are expectations. I think we've all seen, oh man, there's something going on in the Middle East. Gasoline is going to become more expensive because oil is going to go up. Let's all run down to the local store and fill up our cars, which actually is an increase in demand, which increases prices even more, but we'll get there later. The Texas oil man might say, whoa, that's really going to drive up price. Let me hold some back, and I can sell the oil that would go at $50 a barrel today for $70 a barrel tomorrow. So let me hold off and get a higher price tomorrow. So that's all speculation and expectations. In this example, the supply curve shifts to the left. In general, sellers may adjust supply when their expectations of future prices change, if the good is not perishable. If it's not something that has to go to market immediately, if it's something that can be stored like grain or oil, if a seller says, man, it's going to be $20 more a barrel tomorrow or $20 more a bushel tomorrow, I'm going to wait and sell my goods tomorrow. All those are expectations. So, summary of the variables that influence sellers, again, suppliers here. You have price, input prices, technology, number of sellers, and expectations. Again, price of the good causes, a change in that variable causes movement along the supply curve. Whereas input prices, the cost of the raw inputs you put in, the technology and the number of sellers and expectations can all cause shifts of the supply curve inward or outward. So let's work through an example. We can draw a supply curve for, let's say, tax return preparation software. What happens to it in each of the following scenarios? Let's say retailers cut the price of the software. Okay, that's a price affecting the direct supply of software. The second example we're going to work through is a technological advance that allows the software to be produced at a lower cost. And the third example we're going to work through is a professional tax return preparers raise the price of services they provide. Now, just to be clear, tax return preparation software means programs like TurboTax by Quicken or TaxCut by H&R Block or an online service that you use to do your taxes versus using, say, an accountant. So let's take a look at the first example. a fall in the price of a tax return software. So again, tax return software is what we're concerned with here primarily. It's something that's on the axis. It's on this vertical axis here. Price of tax return software and versus the quantity of tax return software. The supply curve does not shift. We just moved along the supply curve to a lower P and a lower Q. So again, you're the seller, supplier of tax return software here. Your price originally here, price 1 and quantity 1. If the price goes down as a seller, again, not a consumer, as a seller, are you going to be willing to provide more or less of your tax return software? Well, the price is lower. You look at your supply curve, the quantity is going to go down because at a lower price, you're making less money, so you're willing to give up less of your good. So you shift from Q1 to Q2. Now, the second example is a fall in the cost of producing software. Okay, so you're a producer of software, again, a supplier of tax return software. You have your price here on the left. Price doesn't change. We're talking about a fall in the cost. So how does that affect the quantity of tax return software, and is that a shift along the demand curve or a shift of the demand curve? Well, again, this is the cost. It's not something that appears on the axes. This is not something that's a movement along the supply curve. It's just shift in the supply curve, but which direction? Well, it's a fall in your costs. So you're making more money per unit of software because your cost went down. Thus, your supply curve shifts to the right, and at each price, at that price, in this example, at each price, no matter what they are, there's a higher supply. The quantity supplied increases. So you have a shift in supply curve, so that's the first thing you need to be able to recognize, not a movement along the supply curve. And you have an increase in quantity. You move from Q1 to Q2. Price didn't change, cost changed. The third example, professional preparers raise their price. Say it's an accountant, CPA. They're going to raise their price for what they charge for doing your taxes. So as a supplier of tax software, tax return software, what does this do? This shifts the demand curve for tax preparation software, not the supply curve. So this is a bit of a trick question. So the supply curve is still there. Okay, it didn't affect your price at all. It didn't affect your input costs at all. Your price is the same. Your input costs are the same. But again, you're a tax return software supplier. This is your competition, your substitute. Okay. Remember we talked about substitutes just moments ago when we were talking about demand. When the price of pizza went up, what happened to the demand for hamburgers? The demand increased. So this is not a supply issue. So you have to really think through this. This again, when your competition, your substitute, raise their price, this shifts the demand curve for tax preparation software, not the supply curve. Now, let's put these two crazy kids together. You hear people say all the time, hey, it's just supply and demand. Well, here it is. Here's just supply and demand. We have price and we have quantities. I believe, judging by these prices here, we now return to the latte example to illustrate the concepts of equilibrium. We're also going to take a look at shortage and surplus. So equilibrium is where price has reached the level where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. It's literally where they cross on the graph. So here in this latte market, here's your supply, here's your demand. The equilibrium appears to fall at $3.15 lattes. So, equilibrium price is the price that equates to the quantity supplied with the quantity demanded. It's where the people who want lattes meet the people who sell the lattes. So lattes go for $3 and there are 15 sold in this oversimplified example. Equilibrium quantity is the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. So again, you have equilibrium. You can go in two directions in the graph. You can go to the left and see $3 is the equilibrium price, and you can see 15 is the equilibrium quantity. Very simple. But again, in the table format, here they all are laid out, the quantity demanded for the market, the quantity supplied for the market. We can use the graph to determine, hey, where does supply equal demand? And we get the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. Now, let's take a look at an example of a surplus, otherwise known as excess supply. When the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. Okay? In this example, we know now this will be equilibrium, it'll be $3.15, but for some reason, the price is $5. We'll get into it, why this can occur much more further down the line, but I want to get you the basics here of what a surplus is. Let's say for some reason the price is $5. Okay? We know the market equilibrium price would have been $3. So what does the consumer feel like? Well, I should be paying $3 and I'm having to pay $5. I'm just going to buy less lattes. So then the quantity demanded is 9. Okay, right here, where that price crosses that demand curve. Okay. Now, what does the supplier say? Man, I'm supposed to be paid $3 and I'm getting $5. I'm going to sell more. So we look at where that price lands on their supply schedule. Again, that's that table. This is an illustration of that table, and it says, hey, at $5, I'm going to be willing to offer 25 lattes. Well, what's the problem here? People only want to consume 9 lattes while they want to supply 25 lattes. When you have more lattes than you need, it's called a surplus. So this results in a surplus of 16 lattes. Again, excess supply. Surplus is when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Facing a surplus, sellers try to increase sales by cutting prices. Mr. Starbucks or Mr. Pete's looks around and says, man, I got all this extra inputs, I got all these extra lattes sitting around. How in the world am I going to get rid of them? I have a surplus. Well, this causes, so what do? They have a sale. They cut prices and say, come in here, we're going to have a sale. We got way too many of these lattes. You see a lot of this with car dealers. There's a lot of shady stuff that goes on there we'll cover later. But we have too many of the 2014 models come in and get them before the 2015s get here, and so on and so forth. Except for here, we're talking about lattes. So there's extra lattes. The suppliers cut price to try to get rid of them. This causes the quantity demand to rise. Okay. It's kind of counterintuitive, but at a lower price, remember this is showing that price goes down, quantity rises, and quantity is supplied to fall, okay, which reduces the surplus. So we're moving towards equilibrium here, both of us, demanders and suppliers, all right. However, we still have a surplus here at $4 because, the market's still saying, hey, it's supposed to be 3 and 15, all right. We still have a surplus of looks like 12 is the quantity demanded and 20 is the quantity supplied. So 20 minus 12, you have a surplus of 8. Okay. Price continues to fall until the market reaches equilibrium. Okay. They went from $5 down to $4. Man, now we still have a surplus of 8 at $4. Let's see if we cut price again, what will happen, and we settle into our equilibrium. Price continues to fall again until the market reaches equilibrium, and everybody's happy because we're in equilibrium. Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Price sticks at $3, and the quantity sticks at 15. So let's look at the opposite. Shortage. In other words, excess demand. When the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Again, there's a lot of backstory as to why this can happen. For now, we just want to keep it simple and say, what if in this example the price of a latte was $1? Well, if the price of a latte is $1 and you like lattes, you're going to demand more lattes because it's inexpensive. Quantity demanded will be 21 lattes at $1. And the quantity supplied, because you're Mr. Starbucks, you don't want to give away your lattes for $1, is only 5. Remember our supply schedule, our demand schedule. At a lower price, people demand more. At a higher price, they demand less. at a lower quantity supplied, their seller's going to sell more, at a higher price they're going to sell more, or they're going to, excuse me, at a lower price the seller's going to sell less, and at a higher price they're going to sell more. Okay. Graphically, you know, when you try to explain all this, it can be quite cumbersome. There's a lot of words being thrown out on this lecture. However, when you look at the graph, it's very simple. Hey, at $1, suppliers are going to be here and demanders are going to be here. That's the beautiful thing about models in economics. Well, when the quantity demanded, because the price is so low, is so high, 21 lattes, and the quantity supplied is so low because the price is so low, as a seller, you don't want to sell many, you have people wanting 21 lattes and Starbucks and Pete's only supplying 5. All right, this results in a shortage of 16 lattes. That's the shortage. The distance from here to here is a shortage. Okay. Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Shortage. So again, facing a shortage, sellers raise the price. Again, for some reason, artificially, the price was at $1, at $1 for a latte, excuse me. And facing a shortage, there's these people that want they want lattes. There's a great demand for it, but there's a unwillingness to sell it at that low price. So what happens? Well, if there's a great demand, let's raise prices and try to sell them and see what happens. So first we go up to $2. This caused quantity demanded to fall because, again, it's more expensive. People want less. Just remember back to the demand schedule. And the quantity supplied to rise. Making more money, you're willing to sell more as a supplier. This reduces the shortage. However, there is still a shortage. It's illustrated here in the gap here between the 2 points on the graph. Now, price continues to rise until they reach market equilibrium. Okay, we get back to that point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, $3 for a latte, and you're going to sell 15 lattes, and the market is in equilibrium. So no matter whether you end up in a shortage or a surplus, the market forces are going to try to move towards equilibrium. So 3 steps to analyzing changes in equilibrium. To determine the effects of any event, there's 3 steps. You can decide whether the events shift the supply curve, demand curve, or both. Step 1 requires knowing all the things that can shift demand and supply, like the non-price determinants of demand and supply. So that can get a little convoluted, but by the end of this course, you'll be very good at it. The second step is to decide in which direction the curve shifts. Is it a positive? Is it a negative for supply and demand? Are they opposite? And then third, use supply or demand diagram. Use the supply and demand diagram or them individually to see how the shifts changes in equilibrium for the price and quantity. You'll see a lot of this both in your homework. You'll get to practice these 3 things, and then also on your test, you're probably going to have some scratch paper where you just sit there and draw it out and say, hey, what would this do? And it really helps you. If you take the time to perfect the graphs in this chapter, it will really lay the tracks for success moving forward, not only in the homeworks, but also the tests and just in economics in general. So it's a very important chapter. I can't stress that enough. So let's work through an example here. Markets or the market for hybrid cars on the on the vertical axis here we have the price of hybrid cars. On the horizontal axis we have the quantity of hybrid cars. We have the supply schedule, the demand schedule here, the supply curve, demand curve, and we have our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity, at least our original price and quantity. Let's say there's a shift in demand. The event that causes a shift in demand is the increase in the price of gas. Well, we all know cars run on gas and hybrids use less gas. So step 1, we know the demand curve shifts. Step 2, which way? Well, we're talking about the cost of something that's an input to the car that uses less of it versus cars that use more of it. So it's kind of a substitute. The hybrid is a substitute for gas guzzlers. So the demand's going to shift to the right. We move from D1 to D2, the red demand curve. Well, what does this do? This shift causes an increase in the price and quantity of hybrid cars. Okay, this was our original S1 and S2 for hybrid cars. The price was here. Hybrid cars, for lack of a better word, become more popular because they consume less gas, and gas has increased in price. So what happens to hybrid cars? People want more of them, Q1 to Q2. And when they want more of them, the price increases. They become more in demand. So supply didn't change, demand did. So here's your new price and your new quantity. More hybrids are wanted at a higher price. Now notice when price rises, producers supply a larger quantity of hybrids, even though the supply curve has not shifted. It's movement along the supply curve here. Why? So the price remember for hybrids went up. Okay, so that's a shift along the supply curve. And then the shift of the demand curve increased quantity. So always be careful to distinguish between a shift in the curve and movement along the curve. We had shift of the demand curve and movement along the supply curve here. Now, terms for shift versus movement along the curve, a change in supply. Now, this is where the language becomes important. Early on, I like to tell my economics students that economics is widely feared because it's made more complicated than it should be in a lot of areas. Economics is something you do every day, something you observe every day. Much of it is just learning the lingo, learning the language. Much of it's just learning what things are called that you've observed before. So the terms for a shift versus movements along the curve are as follows. A change in supply is a shift in the supply curve that occurs when a non-price determinant of supply changes, say like technology or input costs. A change in the quantity supplied is movement along a fixed supply curve that occurs when price changes. Remember, that's on the axis of a change in quantity supplied. So we have a shift of the curve versus a movement along the curve. Change in demand is a shift of the demand curve that occurs when non-price determinants of demand change. Things like income and the number of buyers in the market. Again, a shift of the curve. That's a change in demand. Change in quantity demanded is a movement along a fixed demand curve that occurs when price changes. So remember, you're going to move up and down the supply or demand curve when price changes, and when everything else changes, you're going to have a change in demand or supply, and that's going to be a shift of the curve. It can be very convoluted for you at first, but please, please, please take time. If you have to re-listen to what we're saying on these slides, please do it. If you're going to do one of these videos twice, it's this chapter that you should do. If you're going to read a chapter twice, it should be this text chapter that you read twice. Again, supply refers to the position of the supply curve, while quantity supplied refers to the specific amount that producers are willing and able to sell. Similarly, demand refers to the position of the demand curve, while quantity demanded refers to the specific amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. So let's look at a second example here, shift in supply. What causes it? A new technology reduces the cost of producing hybrid cars. So again, reduces those input costs. So what is the hybrid car producer getting out of this? Well, it's less expensive for them to produce cars, means they're making more money. So at the same prices, they're willing to supply more product. And in this case, if it shifts enough, price can actually decrease. The supply curve shifts to the right because, again, they're willing to supply more because they're making more per car, making more money per car because their cost went down, that is. So the supply curve shifts to the right. We go from S1 to S2. And the shift causes the price of hybrid cars to fall and the quantity to rise. Well, because there are more cars on the market, hybrid cars are more widely available, there's more competition. For a whole host of reasons, the price follows. So price goes from P1 and Q1 down to P2. So you have a decrease in price. There are more cars available at a lower price. supply increased. A shift in both supply and demand curve. Now here's where things get a little convoluted. It's all right. Remain calm, no big deal. Let's say the prices of gas rises and new technology reduces production costs. This is going to cause both curves to shift. We're essentially combining our two examples we just went through. Both shift to the right. Okay. Well, first of all, let's take the price of gas rises. We know that's a demand issue here. We move from D1 to D2 because why? Well, price of gas goes up. Do you want to own a gas guzzling car or do you want to own a hybrid that uses less gas? And again, gas is the thing that's going up. Well, you want to demand more hybrid cars. So the demand shifts. Okay, we know that shifts right. That was our first example we went through. Now your supplier, switch it up. New technology reduces your production costs. Means you're making more money per car. It's less expensive to make them, so you're going to supply more of something that you're making more money on. So both shift to the right. You go from S1 to S2. The new equilibrium in this simultaneous shift here, that's what we're considering it, is a simultaneous shift. If it was not simultaneous, say the gas prices rose, the first year you would have an equilibrium here, and then the second year cost of technology went down, you'd have a shift in supply here. So it can happen over time, but what we're assuming in this example is that it was simultaneous, that both the price of gas rose and the new technology reduced production costs. So we had a new supply curve and a new demand curve and a new equilibrium. So what happened here? Well, the quantity rises, there's more cars being produced, and the demand for those cars increased as well. The effect on price is ambiguous because it's a simultaneous change. We don't fully know what's going to happen to price here. It appears the way we graph this that price went up. That is because we see this gap here. The demand increased more than the supply. If you see the gap between S1 and S2, this little corridor here, and then you see the corridor between demand 1 and demand 2, it looks like the change in demand was larger than the change in supply. Could be quite possible if these gaps were the same, the difference between demands and the difference between supplies, that price could appear to have stayed the same or gone up marginally or even possibly gone down marginally. It all depends on how you draw the graphs, so we consider it ambiguous. If we know for a fact that demand increased more than supply, we can confidently say that price increased. Okay, but if we don't know what the difference was, if I just said, hey, supply increase and demand increase, and I didn't give you graphically the differences here, you can't tell me whether price went up, down, or stayed the same. So keep that in mind. But we do know quantity increased. We know that for sure. So on the other hand, let's say, again, the price of gas rises and new technology reduces production costs. Step 3 continued. See the gap here between supply 1 and supply 2 and the gap here between demand 1 and demand 2. What's wider? Now the supply is wider. So if the supply increases more than demand, price falls. So you can see here price went down. Price 2 is below price 1. Okay, so a lot depends on this gap here. If I don't tell you how far, if I don't tell you that, hey, the increase in supply was larger than the increase in demand, then you can't tell me what happened with price. If I tell you that the increase in supply greatly outpaced the increase in demand, you can tell me, okay, price went down. Okay, so keep that in mind. Again, if you can master these graphs, and if you can carefully read through like things on the test and the homework and say, hey, he said supply increased more than demand here. They're both increasing concurrently. They're both increasing together. Or they're both changing together, and I know that one moves more than the other. You'll know how to graph it. And if you can graph it on a piece of scratch paper and cocktail napkin, whatever, if you take the time to learn this chapter inside and out, and you know how to graph supply and demand and changes in supply and demand and movements along the curve, I will have a very hard time trying to fool you over the next few weeks of this semester. But again, it's all in the preparation. So again, conclusion. How prices allocate resources. One of the 10 principles covered in Chapter 1 of this textbook is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. In market economies, prices adjust to balance supply and demand. These equilibrium prices are signals that guide economic decisions of buyers and sellers and thereby allocate scarce resources. Again, those scarce resources are time, our money, our inputs, whatever we have limits on them. In the textbook, the conclusion of this chapter offers some very nice elaboration on the second bullet point, so I would highly recommend you take a look at that. Again, the reading is paramount in this course. So in summary, a competitive market has many buyers and sellers, each of whom has little or no influence on the market price. Economists use the supply and demand model to analyze competitive markets. The downward sloping demand curve reflects the law of demand, which states that the quantity buyers demand of a good depends negatively on the good's price. If a good's less expensive, you're going to want more of it as a demander. Besides price, demand depends on buyers' incomes, taste, expectations, the price of substitutes and complements, and number of buyers. If one of these factors changes, the demand curve shifts. These are those other factors outside of price. You're going to need to know all of them. Buyer's income, taste, expectations, price of substitutes, complements, and number of buyers. The upward sloping supply curve reflects the law of supply, which states that the quantity seller's supply depends positively on the good's price. Other determinants of supply include input prices, that's the input cost, technology, expectations, and number of sellers. You need to know those as well. Changes in these factors shift the supply curve. So again, as a supplier, if you're making more money, you're going to want to supply more. If you're making less, you're going to want to supply less. And there are movements along the supply curve related to price, and then movements of the supply curve related to input prices, which is your cost of production, technology, expectations, and number of sellers. The intersection of the supply and demand curves determine the market equilibrium. At the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. If the market price is in equilibrium, if the market price is above equilibrium, a surplus results, which causes the prices to fall. If a market price is below the equilibrium, a shortage results, causing the price to rise. Know the differences between the quantity supply and the quantity demanded in a surplus, and then also in a shortage. We can use the supply and demand diagram to analyze the effects of any event on a market. First, determine whether the events of one or both curves. First, determine whether the event shifts one or both of the curves. Second, determine the direction of the shifts. And third, compare the new equilibrium to the initial one so you can make some insights as to what happened to price and quantity. In market economies, prices are the signals that guide economic decisions and allocate scarce resources. So prices are huge, obviously, for both suppliers and demanders. Again, this concludes Chapter 4, the market forces of supply and demand. Again, this is the most important chapter in the textbook. Please take some extra time to master this chapter. It'll make it much easier for you to learn and excel moving forward through this book and through this course. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me during office hours or send me a message anytime via email. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture. And again, please, I stress Chapter 4 is very, very important for your success in this course. Thank you.